There's been a big push over the last couple of years about the importance of emotional intelligence, your EQ, or even your relational intelligence, your RQ. But I really think as a leader, it's your adaptability intelligence, your AQ. Um, Great leaders learn to adapt and change.
This is the Rebel HR Podcast. If you're a professional looking for innovative, thought-provoking information in the world of human resources, this is the right podcast for you. Welcome, Rebel Human Resources listeners. I'm extremely excited to have Kevin Dawson on the show today. Kevin is a brother in SHRM CP credentials, so we got that in common. The other thing we have in common is we are both hosts of podcasts. So Kevin hosts the Leaders and Loggers podcast. Check it out. It's a great podcast. I've listened to a few episodes, and the only regret that I have having Kevin here is the fact that we cannot drink a lager because it's like noon. So thanks, Kevin, for joining us.
Well, you may not be drinking, but it's, I've got a glass sitting next to me just in case.
Well, yeah, I have my W-2 job that I do still need to execute some workload for today. So doing this over my lunch break. So I am probably going to pass. But hey, if you want to get full on snocker, go for it, man.
Well, I appreciate it, Kyle. I really do.
So I'd love to just learn a little bit more about you and about the podcast. And that's not the only thing you do. You're also a leadership and a culture consultant, keynote speaker, author. You have a lot of really great accomplishments. So why don't we start off? Why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a leadership and culture consultant. So a lot of people ask me, well, what does that mean? So I go and I help organizations develop better leaders, better teams, better cultures to help them attract, retain, and engage their talent. Everybody's trying to figure out what does that look like, and we're always being in HR, we're trying to help our organizations succeed, and we want to make sure we have the right people. And sometimes we promote people into positions that are really good at what they do, but they're not really good at leading people. And so I've taken that on as an area that I love to focus on, and building up teams. That's been a part of my career for the last 15 years, is doing that same very thing, but just in very different ways. I started out my career as the education and technology coordinator for a World War II aviation museum. And one of my most favorite jobs doing that was we had a whole bunch of youth volunteers. And so we created an organization within the organization to develop these high school students into young leaders, into the volunteer corps, and different things that we did. A lot of those kids, had aspirations of going into the military or pursuing degrees or careers in aviation. And so we would help prepare them for what that looked like. And then I worked for another nonprofit where I taught how to make good decisions and healthy living habits for students within 200 miles of my hometown out here in West Texas. And so we talked to 10,000 students a year through various programs. And then I moved into sales and marketing and safety role for an oil and gas company, and worked in the oil fields of West Texas for 3 years, which was driving a lot. I'm not sure if people are familiar with how big Texas is, but
yeah.
We tell distance in it's going to take you a couple of hours. How far is it from where I am to Dallas? It's a 5-hour drive or 300 miles. So I covered a territory about half that distance, and I would have to drive that 2 or 3 times a week. But teaching oil and gas operators, service providers, how to develop safety cultures, how to develop safety leaders, and then working as a consultant with Arthur J. Gallagher for a number of years, helping organizations develop programs to attract, retain talent, doing some leadership consulting, leadership training, and that eventually led to the creation of the Leaders and Loggers podcast, which launched almost a year ago now. And as an extended conversation, I had been speaking at SHRM events across Texas and New Mexico and Oklahoma, and started to pick up where I was being invited to larger industry events, speaking out in Orlando or Chicago or San Francisco about leadership and culture issues or talent management. And so a good friend of mine, Bruce Waller, who is the former president for Dallas HR, he's got a blog and now has a podcast, but his blog, he would write on some of those things like, hey, you should start a blog or something. And I was like, I hate writing, so I'm not going to do that. And so the idea was to launch a podcast. And so the podcast launched with the intention of, hey, let's have conversations with leaders about leadership development, organizational culture development, business issues. And we want to do it in a way that makes it feel like it's you and I sitting down at a bar, sharing a drink, and just having a regular conversation, trying to solve these issues. And each week's a different craft beer. And so I've had now 51 different beers.
Nice.
So 51 different episodes so far. And it's been a lot of fun doing that and getting to continue to speak this year. It's been very different because all of my presentations have been virtual, with the exception of 3 at the beginning of the year when we could still travel and do things like normally. And so it's been a lot of fun, and I've really enjoyed the last year doing that. In the process of finishing up my very first book, which is called Crafting Culture. So taking a lot of the same conversations and putting it into a fiction-based book that will take the analogy of the brewing process as a way to show here's how you craft great culture, but using that analogy of here's how you brew good beer.
I love that. I love that analogy. And I'm just kicking myself because I didn't think about a way to intertwine beer into my podcast. So I'm going to have to figure out a way to do that. The other thing that's near and dear to my heart is actually brewing. I started amateur brewing probably about 5 years ago now. And I think it's a great analogy because brewing in and of itself is extremely precise, and you have to control the right things, but also inevitably you completely lose control of something during the brewing process. Something is going to go wrong. So it's all about figuring out your process and figuring out how to do it, but then being able to flex and be nimble. That's a great analogy for what you have to do as a leader, especially in 2020.
Absolutely. So leadership, just like brewing beer, there's parts of it that are very scientific, but there's also parts of it that are bit art to it. You can have the same set of ingredients, or you can add things to it to create something very different, but the process is still very much the same. So you have this ability to follow a process and at the same time put your own spin on how you want it to come out, which is, what great leaders do. They follow a process, but they also put their own spin on it to, make it their own.
I love it. I'm just sitting here. So if there's any Zermologists out there, which is the science of beer, they'll know that the German purity law, Reinheitsgebot, is that there's only 4 ingredients that go into beer, which is water, yeast, hops, and barley. Of course, there's, beer is a lot more varied than that now, but that's the original purity law. But there's a whole lot more than one type of beer, right? I mean, the outcome of brewing is so drastically different depending upon how you build the beer and how you produce it. So yeah, I'm all in. I could probably talk about this for another 2 or 3 hours right now. I'm just like totally nerding out.
Well, it's funny. Like, people are like, "Oh, this is such a great. Like, why hasn't anybody else thought about this?" I'm like, I have no idea. I just capitalized on something that we were doing at my previous company, where we would do happy hours with our clients. We called it benefits and brews, and it was just, hey, let's get together, let's talk about what's going on in your organization. Let's talk about what's going on in your life as a leader, and and let's do it in a fun environment. Come join us for a drink.
I love it. So really hard hitting question. So you have your pilot's license?
I do. So yeah, my dream growing up was to be a fighter pilot. I wanted to be my dream job to this day still is I want to be the commander and leader of the Air Force Thunderbirds. Is that going to happen? No, but that was my dream growing up. And so I mean, ever since I was a little kid, I was fascinated with aviation and would go to air shows all the time with my parents, and still to this day, like I take my son to different air shows around the country, and have been involved with working air shows, and but I want to fly, and so I got my first degree as a professional pilot, where I got my commercial pilot's license. Was getting ready to go fly for the airlines. When I graduated with that degree and through that program, though, Congress had just changed the law for minimum flight hours for the airlines, which it's now 1,500 hours minimum flight time to even be accepted by an airline to fly. At the time I graduated, I had 450 hours, so it was a little ways off.
Were you a Maverick fan, or were you more like Iceman?
Maverick is yeah, Maverick is still my favorite, and if you have not hit far. In fact, in another room in my house, it is the Top Gun room. I do have like the movie poster. I have the logo. I was very disappointed the fact that Top Gun 2 has been pushed back all the way till next summer.
Yeah.
It's like I was already ready for it. Like my best friend and roommate in college, because he was in the program with me. When the 25th anniversary of Top Gun was re-released in IMAX 3D, we drove to the theater in our flight suits to watch the movie.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Now we're going deep here. I'm liking it. This is good. One of my vices, or depending on your point of view, things that's endearing about me is that I love 80s action movies.
So good.
And yeah, so I saw I think it was on Hulu the other day. The kids are in bed. It's like 9:30. I stayed up and watched all of Top Gun just by myself. And it was beautiful. I love it.
Such a great movie. And I had an opportunity to go out to San Diego a couple years ago. My cousin was getting married, and in preparation, because I knew a lot of the movie was filmed in and around the San Diego area, so I was like, all right, I'm going to check out all the Top Gun sites. And the one place that was like on the top of my list, because it was going to be just down the street from where we're staying, is a restaurant called Kansas City Barbecue. And Kansas City Barbecue is where they filmed the scene in the bar where they play the piano, and it's at the very end of the movie. And so I would get so excited. And this is when I was working at the museum. One of my volunteers, who went by the nickname Goose, walks in my office and goes, "Hey, did you hear the Top Gun bar burned down today?"
What?
Yeah, I pulled up Google, and like it had caught fire. The kitchen caught fire, and so the restaurant was shut down. So I did not get my opportunity to go and do that. And I was kind of bummed, because I was going to go to the SHRM conference this year, being it was going to be in San Diego, and so that was on my list of, okay, I'm going to Kansas City Barbecue this time. I'm going to, I don't care what they have on the menu, but I'm going to at least drink and take my picture in front of the jukebox and the piano, and still has not happened.
Well, I'm sorry. I really did not mean to bring up raw wounds here, Kevin. I apologize.
It's okay.
As I think about that movie, I don't know that I would consider Maverick a great leader. He had good results. So I'm curious to understand a little bit about your theory of leadership. I think in the world of HR, leadership is just it's almost like a word that can become relatively meaningless or become a buzzword. And my my opinion is that people who claim to know good leadership are usually using the halo effect to think about people that are like them, and not necessarily reflective on the, what leadership skills may be effective in different scenarios, or kind of the diversity of leadership. So why don't you just kind of give me a perspective on how you approach the question of what is good leadership and what really makes a leader?
So I always start with, what is the true and pure definition of a leader? And it's just somebody who has followers. Um, and kind of start from there. And so as a leader, and if you think you're a leader, number one, do I have followers? And not necessarily do I have social media followers, because that's a totally different
Right.
thing. Because you go on social media, social media influencers, and millions of people follow these, but are they true leaders? Maybe, maybe not. So in your organization, as a leader, are there people who are going to follow you as a leader? And if you do, well, why are they following you? Is it because you're their supervisor, so they kind of have to? Or do they feel inspired by you to want to work there? And for a lot of organizations, it's the former versus the latter with their leaders. They promote people who they may be really good at their job. They're super producers, thinking, well, this person, excelled at their quotas, or they did really good job, doing these projects. So we should promote them into a role that's, has people under them to lead them to do those same things. And they do so, and all of a sudden there's a lot of issues. And organizations are like, well, we'll put money into management training, but management training is not management development. Same with leadership training is not leadership development. There's a lot of things that leaders can already have as built-in traits. I would say there's no such thing as a born leader, but there are born traits of leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have someone who, at the end of the day, is invested in people, that's the number one responsibility of a leader is, are you invested in your people? Are you invested in developing your people? Some of the best leaders surround themselves with people who are smarter than them, better than them, come across in so many different ways. But the one thing that they do well is bringing people together and investing in people to say, we're going to work towards a common goal and go accomplish it. And so when I come to an organization to talk about who their leaders are, I want to know what their goals are, and I want to know what their people's goals are. As a leader, you should know, like, the people who follow you. If you manage a team of people, you should know at least one thing about each individual person, about something that they want to accomplish, both inside the organization and outside the organization. Because the more invested you are to your people, the more willing they are to follow you to wherever it is you're taking them.
We'll be back after a quick break.
And so used to having everything in front of them right away that we forget that innovation just takes time. I myself, I get frustrated too. Why? And this as being one of my best friends is, hey, I talk to you all the time. Hey, man, I'm frustrated in the fact that I can't seem to just get there in the next day. But that's just not how these things work, right? Innovation needs to be planned out. It needs to be very methodical. And then when it finally hits, that's when it seems like to everyone else that it sort of just came out of nowhere. But to you, the amount of dedication that it took over that time.
I love the comment that training does not equal development, because a lot of times I feel like we lump those two things together. But my experience is most of the development actually comes on the job.
Right. Like you could send a lot, have a training program for, managers. Say, hey, we're going to train you to be a good manager, good leader. And you learn a lot of things about here's what it takes to manage people. But it's more theory than it is practical. And you don't get the practical aspect of it until you are actually doing it on a day-to-day basis. And the great thing about the practicality of leadership is you can fail as long as you own up to your failures.
Right. But if you don't own up to it,
then you're just going to create a little bit of resentment. You're going to create distrust. As a leader, you need to have the ability to be authentic to your team. It's okay to be vulnerable. You don't have to be perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect leader. And if you think you know a perfect leader, trust me, there are plenty of flaws that person has, because people are messy and we mess up. And it's okay to mess up. It's okay to say, you know what, I was wrong here. Help me, be better at these things. I remember working for my very first boss, and whenever something would go wrong, instead of deflecting blame to the team, he would be the one that said, hey, this is on me because I didn't prepare the team, or this is the situation. And so he allowed the blame to fall on him, but if we succeeded, it was a team effort.
right.
And it's one of those things that is like this very different. I haven't seen that style of leadership. I had just kind of been like, either you succeed or you fail, and that's it, and it's all on you.
It reminds me of the first, true quote leadership role that I had. 20-something-year-old, truly kid, just graduating out of college, and I was just fortunate that the people that I was leading let me learn as I was working into the role. And I had some really great mentors, but they weren't my leaders. They were actually my, what you would consider a subordinate. But they took care of me. They were just wonderful people. And I made a lot of mistakes, and they called me on it and knocked my ego down quite a bit, which was good. That's what I needed. But ultimately that made me a better leader long term. And, I look back on my career, and it's been kind of an interesting career path, but I attribute a lot of my leadership skills to those wonderful employees that worked quote for me. And I think that the thing that I took away from that is that a leader can't do anything without a good team underneath them. And quite frankly, a leader's probably not doing as much.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's more about making sure people are going the right direction, but you're not the one getting it done. And I think that's where a lot of people can falter.
Yes. So, I mean, I think anybody could list like examples of bad leaders, but great leaders, they kind of move out of the way. They give their team space to operate, and help sure that and make sure everybody's moving in the same direction. One of the things that I ask organizations is, how often do you, as leaders or managers, check in with your team on a one-on-one basis? And if they say, well, we maybe check in once a month, once a quarter, we only do that at our annual reviews, I know right there that there's a lot of issues, because communication is key to leading well. But if you allow so much time in between conversations to develop, your team may think that they're moving in the right direction, or the direction that you want them to move into, and come to find out that they're not. They're going in a direction that, while they think is the right direction, is not the direction you need them to go in. And when you have that conversation, you've allowed so much time to develop that people get frustrated. Like, well, why didn't you say something sooner? So if, as a leader, if you're not at least having a one-on-one conversation on a weekly basis with your team, and it doesn't have to be anything big. It can just be 3 questions. What are you working on this week? How can I support you? And is there anything else that I need to know about? Just those 3 questions. Doesn't have to be anything big, but at least have that conversation one-on-one with each person on our team, because you may find out, well, while they think they're going in this direction to accomplish a project or a task, you may need them to shift priorities to accomplish something else this week versus that one because that's more the priority for you to finish. So your ability to lead really relies and it impacts how often and how effective those conversations can be.
It's so important to understand that, a performance review, an annual performance review, is not enough feedback to consider yourself a great leader.
No, it's not. And in fact, so I've talked a lot about re-engineering performance management and getting back to a more constructive feedback culture with organizations. So the Gallup organization did some research that showed that 74% of organizations do a annual review at minimum of 1 year or greater. And because that there's that big of a gap, the engagement level for employees is significantly low. They said in that study that only 14% of employees said they were highly engaged in their work. But they also showed the correlation. The more often you have a culture of feedback, so the more often you meet, whether it's weekly, monthly, the more engaged an employee feels goes up. So it's important as a leader, as a manager, to have those conversations. It doesn't have to be a true performance review. You just need to know what's going on in their lives, and have an interest in your team's lives beyond just what they're doing for you. One of my favorite stories comes from my friend Patrick, who was my 50th episode guest. He's currently the mayor of Midland, Texas, but before he ran for mayor, he was the executive pastor for one of the largest churches in West Texas. And he would always ask his employees, like, what do you want to do? Like, what are some goals that you want to set for yourself outside the organization? And he tells the story of Jeff, who was the youth pastor at the time. And Jeff had this dream of being a competition barbecue pitmaster, which in Texas, like, that's almost a religion on its own.
Right.
And
that's a goal. That's lofty.
It was a lofty goal. So Jeff would save money and go out and buy briskets because brisket is kind of the king of meats in Texas barbecue. And so he would try different rubs, use different wood to smoke and test out different things and bring those up to the office and share and get feedback from people. Well, Patrick saw that there was going to be a barbecue competition out here and went to his senior staff and said, "Hey, there's this competition coming up. We're going to enter Jeff into this because he needs to know where he stands on this. Plus, it wasn't that he was a great at what he did. It was just that they're like, he's not going to stop bringing this stuff up here until we start doing this." And they were kind of getting tired of the office smelling like barbecue.
What?
I know, it's like, I guess, you don't want a church smelling like barbecue, but it's also a great way to bring people in. So they collected between the senior staff $700 and went to Jeff and said, "Hey, there's a competition coming up in 2 weeks. We want you to enter it and compete. Here's the money. Here's the form. All you got to do is go, pay it and go get what you need. And we want to see you do this." And he said Jeff was just so shocked that his bosses would take the time to see in him something beyond what his job was, and that his whole attitude. And Jeff's already, was a super great guy, but it intensified his performance. It intensified the attitude that he brought to the team. And so Jeff went and competed. He came in last place because, he'd never done it before. So it wasn't going to be like,
it's Texas.
It's Texas. It's not like, if he had won the thing, it should be a movie by now.
Right.
But he did. But he said, but it was just that simple, understanding and asking questions. Who are you? Like, who do you want to be beyond just your title? What your job is? What are the things that you're interested in? What about your family? And asking those questions. It's important. And so as a leader, if you don't have just that personal investment in your team, it's going to be really hard for them to see in you that you have their best interest in mind.
And I think, I think the other thing intertwined in that story is you know people on a more personal level. It's not as transactional as here, do X so that we can achieve Y. Thank you. Here's your paycheck. Goodbye.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, if that's all it was, so I was talking with a friend of mine. We were talking about the word human resources, uh, and it's
Oh, we
like,
can go on this topic for a while.
yeah, and he's like, and he's the chief people officer at one of the largest tax consulting firms in the country. And he said, when I came on board, the first thing I told our boss is, we're getting rid of the HR department, and we're changing it to the people and culture department. We're about people, and seeing people as people, not just a tool. And I think for a lot of leaders, they just look at their people as, well, they're just a tool to accomplish a job. And for my friend, he comes on board in the 5 years that he's been there. They've been 4 years in a row named, one of the best places to work in Dallas.
Yeah, but I think it's, there's been a lot of debate about, people operations, talent, managers, these kinds of, differences within human resources. I tell people, the truth about the phrase HR or the job title HR is, whether you like it or not, it's got a bad rap. I mean, I'll never forget, I got a job in human resources, and I told my mother, who was in higher ed, and I was telling her that I got this job, and I was excited, and I was like, I think it's going to be a good fit for me. And she said, "Oh, human resources, taking the H out of HR." That's my mother, my sweet, innocent mother. But I mean, that is, in a lot of organizations, that's the brand of HR. And if that's your goal in HR, to try to systematize everything and treat people as tools, and not they're the unique individuals that they are, you're gonna struggle, and people aren't gonna like you. I mean, I guess that's kind of the other thing.
Well,
Is
yeah.
like, a lot of people hate HR.
Well, they view HR kind of like, it's the hall monitor in school.
That's a good analogy. Yeah.
It's your HR is there to serve the organization, not the people. And there's been a lot of that conversation I've witnessed over the course of the summer with, all of the racial issues, and talking through things. And I know several people on LinkedIn who, like, they said, we're canceling our SHRM membership because it feels like SHRM is not representing the people, it's representing the organizations. Because they were slow to talk about these issues,
Yeah.
and call them out for what it is. And I think for a lot of organizations, a lot of business owners, business leaders, when they look at HR, it's still viewed as, well, you're the payroll, benefits, and compliance. You're here to hire and fire people. And HR professionals, HR leaders need to take back their role as, you are probably the most strategic partner to the C-suite than anybody else. You can't, if you're the CEO of an organization, you cannot accomplish the goals that you have without people. And so as an HR professional, as an HR leader, learning to be that advocate for people and saying, hey, you need to do these things in order to get where you're going. Well, it's going to require some people. So let's make sure we're working with the right people. And as HR professionals, we also need to learn how to understand the rest of the business. Because, I mean, think about the number of times that you've been handed a job posting, from a department, and say, these are the requirements that we want in an individual. Well, you can go out and find somebody who fits those exact requirements and hire them. But are they going to really be the right fit for the team? Are they going to mesh well with the environment?
Right.
It's one thing to bring someone in from who has a little bit out of an outside mindset, which is great for organizations because it pushes people, it inspires innovation. But if they can't get along with leaders, or that leader can't get along with the person that they bring in, it's not going to work. And even if you hire the perfect person with all those different things that you put on the requirements, at the end of the day, you still got to work well with them. And if you can't work well with them, what's the point?
Right. Exactly. And that, I think that's part of the struggle. I think a lot of people view HR as a very transferable job, which it can be. There's a lot of transferable skills. Don't necessarily need to be a product expert within your industry in order to understand how HR should work. But if you don't take the time to understand your internal customer, your business leader and the product that your organization produces, and truly understand how you impact the bottom line, I just don't feel like you're going to be effective.
No, you're not. I mean, and that's why I think, looking back on in the changes within HR development in the last 20 years, you see the rise in the HR business partner role. It's someone who can say, I understand a little bit more of the business, so let me help this part of the business develop the people side. And I think organizations should look at that model a little bit more than just your traditional HR role, because it changes things. And what's interesting when it comes to developing higher up in the organization, whether you're a chief human resource officer or a chief people officer, majority of the people in those roles did not start out in HR. They started out in sales or marketing or finance and learned the people business along the way, and found that they were really good at the people side, but because they have that business background, they understand how to be strategic.
Right. And I think, one of my arguments for anybody that thinks that HR is the right move for them is I always ask, have you ever been a leader before? Because you're going to be advising leaders. And if you're just sitting here and saying, well, this is how you should handle the situation, but you've never been in that seat, you don't have any street cred, right?
Right.
I mean, you kind of have to pay your dues a little bit before you can start to advise a 20-year plus leader on how to handle an employee situation, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's baptism by fire in HR is not usually the greatest thing in the world.
Although that's how I learned. So, hey, sometimes you just get thrown in and try not to get burnt too bad.
And I mean, yeah, it works well. In fact, that's kind of how my very first job at the museum started. Was I got hired into it because I had volunteered in high school, and they said, hey, we've got this summer program that starts tomorrow. We need someone to teach desert survival skills, and since you have a background and you're a boy, as an Eagle Scout, you should come and teach this. I'm like, do what? All right. Like, I was making up the class as we went. Like here's the materials that you're going to use. But like, oh, okay, great.
That's great. So you're Maverick and you're Bear Grylls. I didn't know. That's awesome.
It's better to be a little bit of a generalist than a specialist sometimes.
No, that's good. That's good. Yeah. So, I mean, but honestly, isn't that that's a great example of what being a leader is like sometimes? There's a lot of times you're totally flying by the seat of your pants. You have no idea, what the right decision is, but sometimes you just have to make a decision and then rally people around it.
So you're absolutely right. Like great leaders, one, are very good with people. Two, they understand their purpose. And three, they don't hesitate. They make decisions, and even if it's the wrong decision, they're gonna make that decision. And if they need to change it, they'll adapt. I was talking with someone the other day. It's there's been a big push over the last couple of years about the importance of emotional intelligence, your EQ, or even your relational intelligence, your RQ. But I really think as a leader, it's your adaptability intelligence, your AQ. Um, Great leaders learn to adapt and change. I remember a friend of mine who we got introduced to each other about 10 years ago, and I had was serving on a youth camp board, and he was the head of all of the counselors, and he was meeting with everybody and said, I need you to be fluid, because if you're flexible, you're still too rigid. And so I've always thought about that statement since I heard him say, like, I need you to be fluid. I need you to be ready to move. And he said, now when you think about fluidity, you can be fluid like water and you can go anywhere. But sometimes that can be dangerous, following that path. So sometimes you need to have a little bit of viscosity to your fluidity, in as it relates to leadership, being able to be adaptable and change, but also having those traits, that make a great leader, whether it's empathy, whether it's honesty, or great communication skills, trust. All of those different things kind of build up. So if you do need to move, you're not going to flow through it real fast, but change can happen, as necessary and as needed.
Yeah, I think what a great example of how important the AQ is. Just take a look at 2020.
Yeah.
I mean, and honestly, I mean, I feel like, let's see, we're recording this in mid-October. This is probably going to go live sometime in early November. I mean, at that point, who knows where we'll be? Maybe, probably another lockdown, the way the trajectory of this thing's going. And the organizations that have succeeded are the ones that were nimble and fluid and, adapted quickly, changed the way they worked, communicated well. And the ones that didn't struggled.
Yeah. I mean, I remember watching organizations say, hey, you know what, we're going to move to remote workforces, even before things were starting to shut down. So, you know what, we're going to move to remote workforces and we're going to start doing remote teams. And here's how we're going to adapt and survive. And the best organizations in that environment, communication was a huge piece of that. They checked in with their teams. They gave them that flexibility and freedom to do what they're supposed to do. But also, if you're working from home, I can still be just as productive as if I was working from the office. So, you know what, I may need to take a break and, walk the dog around the neighborhood for a little bit to come back and clear my mind and get back to being productive again. And organizations saw that there was a rise in productivity when they were able to have good investment into their people, and their people felt like there was good information and feedback, and they were in the loop of what was going on. Organizations that didn't have that, they struggled, and they still struggle.
Yeah. I mean, something I like to share with people, my organizations, we're international. A large part of my job before the pandemic was traveling. Upwards of 40-50% of the time I was on the road, and I love to travel. It was great, but you can only do so much when you have 27 different locations to travel to. You're going to be disconnected from some of your locations with a strategy like that. Now, I mean, we started doing video conferencing. We have a great IT department that made sure that we had the appropriate tools in place. Started doing a lot more collaboration outside of email. Did some some of the like text software and that sort of thing. And I mean, everybody just started to connect more, even though we were going through this extremely disruptive period. And it was almost kind of like a silver lining for us in my organization to realize, oh, we can do things a little bit differently, and we can actually be a little bit more nimble because we can communicate better.
Now, have you noticed in doing so that your engagement has gone up?
Yeah, I think so. I'll tell you in about a week, because we're going to wrap our employee survey. We're doing an employee opinion survey, so I'll let you know. Take a rain check on that. I would tell you though that I don't know if I would call it engagement. I would call it connectedness has increased.
Gotcha.
The people who are comfortable reaching out to me or shooting me a note or questioning a process of it's increased exponentially. Whereas before, I think it was, maybe a little bit of a hesitancy to actively outreach and ask questions and things like that. So, I think we're getting better at communicating in general. I think probably my favorite thing is the fact that there's less silos.
Yep.
There are people who are more apt to pick up the phone and call somebody in a different country or a different business unit to ask for help and advice because they don't have the water cooler to go, have an accidental discussion to help them solve their problem. So it's been interesting. But on the flip side, I think there is a higher burden on a leader to make sure that the people who aren't connected get kind of forced to a little bit too. Right? It's like that
Yep.
connection, the touch base for the people that might be struggling. It's not as apparent who is struggling, and our work is professional and scientific and design work and very very technical in nature. So we don't necessarily have like really clear productivity measurements to look at to understand if somebody's struggling in their work. So it's been interesting. So if you're asking me, future state, what's going to happen after this is all done, I think we'll probably have a hybrid work situation where there'd be a little bit more flexibility, but we still have some of the office people working.
Yeah, I think you're probably not going to be alone in that. And I think a lot of organizations have said, if we can operate this way and still be productive and be engaged, have open communication, silos are broken down, I think you'll see a lot more move in that direction.
Great topic here, Kevin. I want to make sure that we get through our flash round here. So this is a series of really hard-hitting questions. I'll try to take it easy on you, but we're going to jump right in. So brace yourself.
Gotcha.
All right, flash round. Question number 1. What are you reading right now?
So I just finished The Heart of Leadership, and which is a phenomenal book. But I am reading The Purpose Factor by Brian and Gabrielle Boucher. They're some friends of mine that I've been working with for the last couple of months. Their program, The Purpose Mastery, is a real intensive program to help organizations or leaders kind of really refine what their purpose is, what's their story, and how to really use that to influence people. And so they've written a book about it called The Purpose Factor. So I'm reading through it. It's a phenomenal book. They've gotten some amazing endorsements from people like The Rock, Tim Tebow, Brian Tracy, Lewis Howes, Simone Biles, Coach Tony Dungy. So I'm super, super proud of the work that they've done, but it's a phenomenal book.
Good for them. Yeah, I mean, if The Rock likes it, then there you go.
Yeah.
I to date I still have not had a Rock comment or thumbs up yet, so I can't say that that's on my list of accomplishments yet.
Yeah, well, maybe one of these days.
One of these days. Yeah, if he ever gets a burning passion for human resources best practices, we'd be happy to have him on the show. So Dwayne, if you're listening right now, check it out. All right. Next question. Who should we be listening to?
Well, I would say the Leaders and Loggers podcast is a great resource for learning about leadership, but that might be a little self-serving. Hey
man, plug it.
But I'm gonna. But actually, one of my favorites to listen to is called Breakfast with Sis, which is Tony Bridwell and his daughter Allie Koch. Tony is the chief people officer at Ryan, and his daughter Allie is a muralist and artist, and so they actually bring in different people in their respective worlds to talk about business and culture. And it's just a really great show. Tony himself is an author, of several different books on leadership. His most recent is called Saturday Morning Tea: The Power of Story to Change Everything. And their conversations on their podcasts are absolutely great to listen to.
I love it. And I think just a pitch. I know people that are listening to this obviously listen to podcasts, but I really wasn't a podcast listener until just this year. And honestly, it was because I didn't have time, or I didn't make time rather. But quarantine happened, and I started to listen and learn and connect. And there's so much out there. And I think especially in the world of HR and the world of leadership, at times it can be really isolating, and you just have to connect with somebody that's having similar challenges at times. And so yeah, great call out on the podcast. I do recommend the Leaders and Loggers podcast. So I'll give you the plug there. I think that's how we got connected, and
Yep.
really appreciate you sharing your insight as well as your guest insight on your podcast every week. It's great
I
listening.
appreciate that, Kyle.
All right, final question, the toughest one. How can our listeners connect with you?
Sure. So LinkedIn is probably my go-to right now for social networks. So you can find me at Kevin C. Dawson on LinkedIn. You can also find the podcast on social media. You just search for Leaders and Loggers, Lagers, not the log, like the folks in the timber industry. I've had a lot of people say,
although that would be an intriguing podcast.
It would be, and maybe I need to reach out to somebody in the timber industry to come on the show, because that would be a great and humorous plug there.
I love it.
But yeah, you can find me on social media. So I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin C. Dawson, Instagram Kevin C. Dawson. You can follow the podcast on social media. We're on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and if you're a beer drinker, you can even follow us on the Untapped app. You can see what we're drinking and drink along with us.
All right, Kevin. Well, I really appreciate the time today. I know that you are a busy guy with a book, podcast, trying a lot of different beers. I'm sure you have to do a lot of quality control, so I really appreciate it. Yeah, great insights. I think one of the challenges of HR is while you might not have direct reports, you're still a leader, and you still have to influence others in an appropriate manner. So great topics for our listeners, and really appreciate your expertise and time on the show.
Well, Kyle, I really have appreciated it. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. All right, that does it for the Rebel HR podcast. Big thank you to our guests. Follow us on Facebook at Rebel HR Podcast, Twitter at Rebel HR Guy, or see our website at rebelhumanresources.com. The views and opinions expressed by Rebel HR Podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any of the organizations that we represent. No animals were harmed during the filming of this podcast.
Baby.